The summer of 1943 was brutal for German soldiers. In North Africa, under the blazing desert sun, thousands of men in gray uniforms found themselves surrounded, cut off, and utterly defeated. The once proud Afrika Korps, who had marched with swagger under Rommel, were now prisoners of war. For years, German propaganda had painted a terrifying picture of what capture by the Allies meant. Soldiers were told they would be starved, humiliated, and perhaps even executed. Many had grown up believing that surrender was worse than death. So, when these men finally laid down their weapons and lifted their hands, an uneasy silence fell among them. Their futures were uncertain, and in their minds, it was filled with nightmares. The journey into captivity began under armed escort. German POWs marched through Allied lines, passing soldiers who sometimes looked at them with curiosity, sometimes with disdain, but rarely with cruelty. It was a shock. Many German troops had expected to be beaten immediately. Instead, they were given water, bread, and cigarettes. It was confusing. Some whispered to each other, "Is this just a trick? Will the real punishment begin later?" What came next was even more disorienting. After temporary holding camps in Africa and Europe, thousands of German POWs were loaded onto ships bound for a land they had never imagined seeing, the United States of America. For many of them, the very idea of being shipped across the Atlantic was surreal. Would they survive the journey? Would the Americans treat them as men or as animals? These questions haunted them as the ships crossed the ocean. When they finally arrived at ports in New York, Boston, or Norfolk, they were stunned. The cities they glimpsed from the decks weren't bombed-out ruins like Berlin or Hamburg. Instead, they saw towering buildings, neon signs, and bustling crowds. America seemed untouched by war, overflowing with life and abundance. For young German soldiers who had grown up in the shadow of ration cards and Allied bombing raids, this was already like another world. But the real surprise was yet to come. From the ports, POWs were loaded onto trains. They looked out the windows and saw rolling green fields, modern highways, and well-fed civilians. Some even saw cars lined up at diners, families laughing, children playing baseball in open parks. For many Germans, this was the first time they realized just how much America had been shielded from the devastation consuming Europe. Their destination was even stranger. Instead of barbed wire compounds filled with harsh treatment, they were brought to sprawling prison camps, often in quiet American towns. Camps in Texas, Oklahoma, and the Midwest were enormous, but surprisingly orderly. The barracks were clean, the food was plentiful, and most shocking of all, the guards didn't seem intent on tormenting them. In fact, many American guards treated them with a professionalism and discipline that was utterly foreign to the POWs' expectations. At night, the camps echoed with German voices, hushed conversations about what would happen next. Some feared the kindness was only temporary. Others speculated that the Americans wanted to trick them into letting down their guard. But slowly, as days turned into weeks, a startling reality began to sink in. Life inside an American POW camp was nothing like the horror stories they had been told back home. The food was better than many German soldiers had eaten in years: meat, bread, vegetables, and even coffee. They were given soap, medical care, and clothing. Some couldn't believe it when they were allowed letters to and from their families back in Germany. The initial terror of capture began to fade, replaced with confusion, curiosity, and a strange sort of cautious hope. And then, something happened that no German soldier could have possibly imagined. Within weeks of settling into these camps, they saw something that made them stop in their tracks, staring in disbelief. Out on the open fields, right next to the barracks and watchtowers, American soldiers and civilians were gathering to play baseball. The clink of bats, the cheers of spectators, the crack of the ball soaring into the sky. It was like nothing they had ever seen before. Baseball wasn't just a sport. It was a cultural ritual, a slice of American life, brought right into the prison camps. To the POWs, who had expected brutality and endless punishment, this moment marked the beginning of a shocking new chapter. For the first time, they wondered, were they truly prisoners, or had they somehow stumbled into another world altogether? 4 German prisoners of war, The first days inside American prison camps were surreal. The tall fences topped with barbed wire reminded them that they were captives, but almost everything else about the camps challenged their darkest expectations. When they entered their barracks, they didn't see dark, filthy cells or cramped spaces. Instead, they found long wooden huts with clean bunks, windows for air circulation, and even stoves for heating in winter. There was order, structure, and discipline, but not cruelty. Every morning began with a roll call. Guards, many of them young Americans who had never been overseas, lined up the German POWs, counted them, and then went about their business. It quickly became clear that the guards weren't interested in constant intimidation. They did their duty, but they rarely shouted or humiliated the prisoners. For German soldiers, who had grown used to harsh discipline under the Nazi system, this calm professionalism felt strange, almost unsettling. Food became the first real shock. Breakfasts of eggs, bread, oatmeal, and sometimes bacon were placed on the tables. Lunches and dinners often included meat, potatoes, beans, and even desserts. To men who had lived through years of rationing, where a single piece of bread could be a treasure, this abundance felt almost unreal. Some POWs joked that they ate better as prisoners in America than as soldiers in Hitler's army. Letters from home deepened the contrast. Families back in Germany wrote about hunger, bombings, and fear. Meanwhile, their sons and fathers in America were eating 3 meals a day, sleeping in clean beds, and watching the war from a distance. For many, the guilt of this disparity weighed heavily. They couldn't believe that the enemy treated them more humanely than their own regime sometimes treated civilians. But what truly transformed camp life was how the Americans filled the prisoners' days. Boredom could have turned these camps into hotbeds of unrest. Instead, the U.S. military introduced work details, educational programs, and, most surprisingly, recreation. Camps had libraries stocked with books, sometimes in German. Classes were offered in English, mathematics, and even trades like carpentry or mechanics. Some POWs later recalled that they learned more inside American prison camps than they had in school back home. And then, of course, there was the baseball. At first, the Germans stood at a distance, curious, but confused. Baseball was not a sport they knew. The rules seemed bizarre, a pitcher throwing a small white ball, a batter swinging a wooden stick, and players running in a diamond-shaped field. But soon, curiosity turned into fascination. German prisoners lined up against the fences to watch American guards, local civilians, and sometimes even other POWs play the game. It was more than just entertainment. To the Germans, baseball became a window into American culture. They noticed how seriously the Americans took the sport, how it wasn't just about winning, but about camaraderie, teamwork, and tradition. On Sunday afternoons, when games drew larger crowds, the POWs could hear the laughter, the cheers, and the unmistakable sense of normalcy. It was as if war didn't exist on that field. Before long, some camps even organized baseball games for the prisoners themselves. With makeshift bats and balls, German POWs attempted to imitate the strange American pastime. At first, they were clumsy, missing swings and stumbling around bases. But with time, they got better. For many, learning baseball was not just a way to pass the hours. It was a way to connect, however faintly, with the society that had captured them. The Americans, too, noticed the effect. Allowing the POWs to watch and even play sports reduced tension, encouraged discipline, and humanized the prisoners. Guards reported fewer incidents of unrest. The simple act of handing over a bat or glove to a former enemy carried a quiet message. You are still human, even if you wore the wrong uniform. This shocked the German prisoners more than anything else. Back home, they had been told Americans were ruthless, barbaric, and cruel. Yet here they were, being treated with dignity, being fed properly, and being allowed to enjoy one of America's most beloved traditions. The dissonance was overwhelming. In whispered conversations inside the barracks, many POWs admitted that their worldview was crumbling. If America could be so generous to its enemies, what else had they been lied to about? And what did this mean for the future of Germany once the war was over? For now, though, the prisoners clung to the strange new rhythm of life. Morning roll calls, hearty meals, letters from home, and the distant echo of a baseball being hit across the diamond. War still raged across Europe, but behind the fences of these American camps, the seeds of a different kind of transformation were being planted, one that would reshape how these men saw the world, and even themselves. For many German prisoners of war, the first days inside American camps were dominated by confusion and disbelief. They expected hunger, cruelty, and humiliation. Instead, they were met with food, respect, and even leisure. But among all the surprises, nothing seemed more absurd, more utterly foreign, than the sight of Americans obsessing over baseball. At first, the prisoners laughed. They watched from behind the fences as American guards tossed the small white ball back and forth, shouting strange words like strike, home run, and out. The Germans, who were used to soccer and handball, couldn't make sense of it. Why did the players run in circles instead of straight lines? Why were there so many pauses in the action? To them, the game looked slow, confusing, and almost comical. But curiosity soon began to replace laughter. Every afternoon, when work details ended and guards gathered for a quick game, the POWs pressed against the wire to watch. They began to notice the patterns, the way pitchers tried to outsmart batters, the bursts of excitement when someone connected with a ball, and the sudden eruptions of cheers from both players and spectators. Baseball wasn't chaos. It was strategy, discipline, and patience woven into one. Some prisoners whispered to each other, "This is America's war dance." Others described it as a national ritual. What shocked them most wasn't just the game itself, but how deeply Americans seemed to love it. To the prisoners, baseball wasn't just a sport. It was a window into the American soul. The U.S. military understood this too. They realized that recreation wasn't a luxury in the camps. It was a tool. Sports provided an outlet for frustration, prevented unrest, and built a strange sort of bridge between captors and captives. Slowly, camp authorities allowed the Germans to participate. Baseballs and bats made their way into the hands of men who, just months earlier, had carried rifles against the Allies. The first attempts were awkward. A German swinging at a pitch might spin in a full circle and miss completely, drawing laughter from fellow prisoners. Runners sprinted to the wrong bases. Gloves were worn incorrectly, and fly balls were dropped again and again. But nobody cared. For the prisoners, it was freedom. Not literal freedom, but a freedom of the spirit. For a few hours, they weren't enemies of America. They were simply men, laughing, playing, and competing. Some camps even organized leagues. POWs formed teams, often naming them after German cities: Berlin Bears, Hamburg Eagles, or Munich Wolves. Matches were held in open fields inside the fences, with crowds of fellow prisoners cheering loudly from the sidelines. American guards sometimes joined in, coaching the Germans on batting stances, pitching techniques, or the subtle strategies of the game. For many, this interaction was the first time they had spoken to an American without hostility. The more they played, the more the Germans began to understand why baseball mattered. Unlike soccer, where victory depended on speed and stamina, baseball rewarded patience, planning, and teamwork. A good batter wasn't always the one who swung hardest, but the one who knew when not to swing. A pitcher had to think 3 steps ahead, anticipating not just the batter's move, but the entire flow of the game. To German POWs, raised on rigid discipline and military obedience, this was fascinating. Baseball mirrored strategy on the battlefield, only without bloodshed. Letters written after the war reveal just how powerful this discovery was. One prisoner recalled, "It was in those dusty camp fields, with a bat in my hands, that I realized Americans fought differently. They weren't reckless. They were patient, methodical, and always thinking ahead. Baseball was their school of war." Another noted that the sport showed him the balance between individual freedom and collective effort, a lesson he would carry back to Germany long after the fences came down. But beyond strategy, there was something even more shocking: the humanity of it all. Baseball gave the prisoners joy. It gave them laughter, and it gave them the chance to be treated not as enemies, but as men who could share in the simple pleasures of life. When German POWs stood on dusty diamonds and swung at a pitch, they were no longer representatives of Hitler's regime. They were simply young men enjoying a game. Some prisoners later admitted that these baseball games did more to break Nazi propaganda than any leaflet or lecture ever could. They had been told that Americans were ruthless and barbaric, but here they were, teaching their enemies how to bunt, how to throw a curveball, how to cheer for a teammate. Baseball became, in a sense, an ambassador of American values, freedom, fairness, and fun. And as days turned into months, the Germans stopped mocking the strange sport. They started respecting it, then embracing it, until baseball became part of their own camp culture. Some even joked that when they returned to Germany, they would introduce the game back home. What began as laughter at a foreign sport became fascination, and then transformation. For the German POWs, baseball wasn't just a pastime. It was a quiet, powerful reminder that life could be about more than war, more than ideology, more than survival. It could be about play, teamwork, and joy, values that would stay with them long after the war ended. By 1944, German prisoners of war in the United States numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Scattered across more than 500 camps, they were part of a vast network that stretched from the pine forests of Alabama to the wide fields of Kansas, from the deserts of Arizona to the snowy landscapes of Wisconsin. Each camp had its routines: morning roll call, work details in nearby factories or farms, and long afternoons behind the wire. But what separated American camps from anything these soldiers expected was the effort put into recreation. The U.S. military knew that idle men could become restless men, and restless men could become dangerous. To prevent unrest, camp administrators turned to something that seemed almost trivial at first: organized play. Baseball, in particular, became a tool not just for recreation, but for reshaping the very morale of thousands of captured soldiers. Prison yards were transformed into makeshift diamonds. Outfields stretched across dusty lots or grassy patches, and bases were marked with chalk or even scraps of wood. Fences of barbed wire loomed beyond the field, a constant reminder of captivity. But once the games began, the boundaries seemed to vanish. The clang of bats meeting balls replaced the distant echoes of war. American guards often played alongside their prisoners, creating scenes that defied the very nature of conflict. Imagine it. Just months earlier, these men might have faced one another across a battlefield in Tunisia, Sicily, or Normandy. Yet here they were, sharing a field, laughing at a wild throw, or congratulating a teammate after a stolen base. For German POWs, this was a revelation. They had been told to expect cruelty, but they found camaraderie instead. Over time, the camps developed entire baseball cultures. POWs began forming official teams, designing crude uniforms from donated clothing, and even creating team flags or mascots. Scoreboards were painted on wooden boards, and enthusiastic fans, fellow prisoners with no game that day, filled the sidelines with chants and cheers. These matches became camp events, lifting spirits in ways that even hot meals could not. For many German soldiers, baseball quickly became more than a pastime. It was a coping mechanism, a way to reclaim a sense of normalcy in a world turned upside down. Each swing of the bat, each sprint around the bases, allowed them to forget for a brief moment the uncertainty of their futures. Would they survive the war? Would they ever see their families again? Nobody knew. But for 9 innings, none of that mattered. Prisoners who had once felt humiliation at capture began to discover a strange sense of dignity in these games. They were not defined solely by their uniforms, their past battles, or the ideology that had brought them to war. Instead, they were players, teammates, competitors. Baseball gave them an identity outside of Hitler's army. It allowed them to rediscover something deeply human: joy. What shocked them even more was the generosity of the Americans. Guards shared gloves, balls, and bats, sometimes even ordering new equipment for the prisoners. When leagues grew popular, some camps brought in umpires, scorekeepers, and even small wooden bleachers. American newspapers occasionally reported on these games, marveling at the sight of enemy soldiers playing America's pastime with such enthusiasm. The symbolism was powerful. Baseball diamonds inside prison camps became spaces where the war's brutality was suspended. They became places where enemies learned to see each other not as threats but as people. Many POWs later confessed that these games were their first real glimpse into the character of America, Not its tanks, not its bombers, but its humanity. And for the Americans, there was purpose too. Baseball was more than just kindness. It was strategy. By treating prisoners with fairness, the U.S. hoped to encourage German compliance and prevent uprisings. More importantly, they hoped to plant seeds of democracy and openness, values that would take root once these men returned home. And it worked. One POW later wrote, "We came to America expecting punishment. Instead, they gave us bats and gloves. They showed us that freedom is not only in politics, but also in play." Baseball taught us that Americans lived not in fear, but in confidence. These dusty prison diamonds behind barbed wire became classrooms of culture. And for thousands of Germans, baseball wasn't just an introduction to a sport. It was their first step toward understanding a very different world, one where enemies could laugh together, and where the sound of a ball cracking off a bat could mean more than the sound of gunfire. The irony was not lost on them. They had come to America as prisoners of war. But many later admitted that in those games, they felt more free than they had in Hitler's army. By the spring of 1944, something extraordinary was happening inside America's POW camps. What began as shock and disbelief among captured German soldiers, seeing their guards casually tossing baseballs on the field, was slowly transforming into genuine curiosity. The once defiant prisoners, who had entered the camps expecting misery and humiliation, found themselves staring at a game they did not understand but could not ignore. At first, the Germans only watched from the sidelines. The crack of the bat, the cheer of the crowd, the sudden sprint of players running toward bases. It was all foreign to them. To men raised on soccer and European traditions, baseball seemed strange, almost comical. But boredom inside the barbed wire was powerful. Days blurred together with endless routines, and soon, watching these games became a welcome escape. The American guards, perhaps sensing the curiosity, did something remarkable. They began inviting prisoners to step onto the field. At first, only a few volunteered, mostly younger men with adventurous spirits. They were handed gloves, bats, and instructions that were part broken English, part hand gestures. The first attempts were clumsy, missed swings, fumbled catches, confused looks when someone shouted "steal second." Yet the laughter that followed was genuine, not mocking. For the first time, enemies were not divided by uniforms, but united by the rhythm of a simple game. One German prisoner later recalled, "We thought baseball was nonsense. Why run in circles after hitting a ball? But then we began to love it. It gave us life inside the wire." The camps soon organized regular matches. Some prisoners grew so enthusiastic that they crafted makeshift scoreboards, team names, and even banners. The guards, amused and perhaps proud, encouraged the games. It became clear that baseball was more than entertainment. It was a tool of transformation. The German officers, who once lectured their men about staying loyal to the Reich, found themselves powerless against the pull of the sport. A baseball glove could turn a hardened soldier into a laughing boy again. And in those moments, the ideology of war faded into the background. But baseball was not the only surprise waiting for the prisoners. Many camps also introduced educational programs. Universities sent professors to teach mathematics, literature, and languages. Some POWs attended art classes, while others studied engineering or agriculture. The Red Cross and the YMCA provided books, musical instruments, and sports equipment. The goal was simple: keep the men occupied and give them a constructive outlet. The German prisoners compared this with the horror stories they had been told. Nazi propaganda had painted a terrifying picture. American camps would be brutal, cruel, and degrading. Instead, the reality stunned them. They were being treated not as animals, but as human beings, sometimes even better than their own soldiers were treated in German camps. Of course, the camps were not paradises. Prisoners still lived under guard, still missed their families, and still carried the shame of defeat. But the presence of baseball gave them something precious: dignity. They could compete, laugh, and feel alive. Some prisoners became so skilled that they could rival American players. There are accounts of German POW teams defeating local American squads, which shocked audiences. Imagine small-town Americans, who had lost sons and brothers in the war, watching German prisoners hit home runs on their own soil. The irony was not lost on anyone. And yet, instead of anger, there was often a strange sense of respect. Through baseball, the enemy became familiar. The war was still raging across the ocean, but inside those fences, something different was happening. Men who once swore to fight to the death were now learning teamwork, sportsmanship, and even friendship. By late 1944, baseball leagues among POW camps were thriving. Some camps held tournaments that drew large crowds of prisoners and guards alike. The fields echoed with shouts in English and German, blending into a universal language of competition. For the Germans, the game symbolized something profound, the possibility of a world beyond war. As one prisoner put it years later, "On the field, we were no longer Nazis or Americans. We were simply players, chasing the same ball." What none of them realized at the time was how deeply this experience would shape their lives after the war. For many, baseball in captivity became the first taste of freedom, hope, and reconciliation. And as they prepared for the war's final chapters, the memory of those games stayed with them, reminding them that even in captivity, humanity could shine brighter than hatred. When the war finally drew to its bloody conclusion in 1945, millions of German soldiers remained scattered in captivity across Europe, Africa, and America. For those held in the United States, the news of Germany's surrender was met with mixed emotions: relief that the fighting was over, grief for their homeland in ruins, and uncertainty about their own fate. Yet within those barbed wire fences, another story had quietly been unfolding, one that would follow them home in ways they never expected. For years, baseball had been their constant companion. It began as an odd curiosity, became a pastime, and eventually turned into a passion. Now, as the prisoners prepared for repatriation, they wondered, would this game disappear from their lives as quickly as it had arrived? Or had it somehow become a part of them? The Americans, aware that the war was ending, doubled down on educational and recreational programs in the camps. Baseball tournaments grew even larger, often drawing crowds of thousands, POWs, guards, and even local civilians. Newspapers across America reported on the phenomenon. "Germans play baseball behind the wire," headlines read, with photos showing grinning prisoners sliding into bases or swinging for the fences. To the outside world, it was a curiosity. To the prisoners, it was a lifeline. Baseball had taught them teamwork in a setting where mistrust had once ruled. It had taught them discipline outside the strictness of military command. And most of all, it had shown them that even enemies could share something joyful. When ships finally began carrying German POWs back across the Atlantic, baseball gear often came with them. Gloves, bats, and balls were stuffed into duffel bags, hidden under uniforms, or gifted by sympathetic guards. One American officer remembered, they were more excited about bringing baseball home than cigarettes or chocolate. Back in Germany, the sight was astonishing. Cities lay in rubble, food was scarce, and the nation was gripped by shame and hunger. Yet in meadows, ruined parks, and open fields, former soldiers began tossing baseballs, teaching the rules to curious onlookers. Children who had never heard of Babe Ruth or Joe DiMaggio learned how to swing a bat from men who only months earlier had fought for Hitler's army. At first, baseball was treated with suspicion. Many Germans considered it an American sport, a symbol of the occupying forces. But gradually, the game gained traction. It was simple, required little equipment, and above all, it was fun. For people starved not only of food but of hope, baseball provided something priceless: escape. Some POWs went further. They organized local leagues, using chalk to mark bases and tree branches as bats when real gear was scarce. Games attracted small crowds, and slowly, baseball began carving out a niche in post-war German life. Historians often say culture travels with armies. That was certainly true for jazz, Coca-Cola, and Hollywood films. But in the case of baseball, it traveled home with the very men who had once been enemies. Ironically, it was not American soldiers who spread the game in Germany after the war. It was German prisoners, returning from captivity with bats in hand and rules memorized. The symbolism was powerful. In a nation shattered by conflict, where old ideologies had collapsed and mistrust ran deep, baseball became a neutral ground. A German boy could pitch to an American soldier, And for those few minutes, there were no conquerors or conquered, only teammates. For some former POWs, the game shaped their lives beyond sport. Men who had studied English or American culture in the camps later became translators, teachers, or liaisons during the Allied occupation. Their first exposure to American values had not been through political speeches, but through afternoons on dusty fields, where they learned patience, fairness, and resilience. Of course, baseball never replaced soccer in Germany. The national love for football remained unshaken. But baseball carved out a small but meaningful presence, especially in the years immediately after the war. And it carried with it a memory of transformation. How men who once swore to die fighting the Americans had instead laughed, played, and found humanity through an unlikely sport. One POW later reflected in an interview, "When I returned home, I had two things in my bag, my uniform and a baseball glove. The uniform reminded me of the past. The glove reminded me of the future." By the late 1940s, as Germany rebuilt itself from the ashes, baseball quietly continued in schoolyards and Allied clubs. It never became the national sport, but its presence was undeniable, a legacy not of war, but of reconciliation. The German POWs who had once been stunned to see baseball inside prison camps had now carried that shock into a lasting story. What started behind fences became a bridge between two worlds. And in the end, baseball had achieved what weapons could not. It turned enemies into teammates, and prisoners into teachers of a new game. As the last German POWs were shipped home, the camps that once buzzed with life grew quiet. The barbed wire fences, the guard towers, the barracks, all of it began to vanish. Yet for the men who had lived there, one thing could never be erased: the memories of afternoons spent beneath the sun, swinging bats, running bases, and cheering for teams that had nothing to do with armies or flags. For many, the image of war had always been brutal, merciless, and filled with hatred. Nazi propaganda had drilled into them that Americans were monsters, ruthless killers, waiting to humiliate and torture any prisoner they captured. But in those prison camps, the truth had been far different. Instead of cruelty, they found classrooms. Instead of endless punishment, they found baseball diamonds. Instead of enemies, they found fellow human beings. It is here that the story of German POWs in America becomes larger than sports. Baseball was just the surface, the visible symbol of something deeper. What truly shocked the prisoners was the humanity of their captors. At first, they could not believe it. Some thought it was a trick, others assumed it was temporary. But day after day, as they were given decent food, allowed to read, learn, and even play games, the realization set in. The world was not as simple as Nazi propaganda had told them. This realization would have consequences far beyond the fences of those camps. When the prisoners returned home, they carried with them stories that directly challenged the myths of their old regime. They told their families and neighbors, "The Americans did not treat us as animals. They treated us better than our own army often did." For a broken Germany, these testimonies helped reshape perceptions. And here lies the irony. Hitler's officers had been stunned by American industry, the ability to build 50,000 tanks in just 3 years, the endless fleets of planes and ships. But what truly stunned the average German soldier in captivity was not the tanks or the weapons. It was baseball. It was ice cream, cigarettes, jazz music, and the strange kindness of strangers who should have hated them. The baseball games became the most vivid symbol of this contrast. A German POW once wrote in his diary, "It was the strangest moment of my life. 1 week earlier, I had been shooting at Americans. Now I was playing their game, and they were cheering me on." Of course, not every camp was perfect, and not every story was filled with joy. There were hardships, frustrations, and homesickness. But compared to the nightmare that German soldiers had been led to expect, the reality was nothing short of astonishing. And in that gap, between expectation and reality, was born a lesson that transcended the war. Baseball, in this context, was not just a sport. It was a teacher. It taught former enemies that rules, fairness, and respect could exist even in captivity. It taught that competition did not always need bloodshed. And most importantly, it taught that identity could shift, that a Nazi soldier could also be a teammate, a friend, or simply a man who loved the crack of a bat against the ball. In many ways, the story of German POWs in baseball mirrors the larger story of the war's end. The Allies, faced with the challenge of not only defeating Germany, but also rebuilding it, realized that the future would be determined not just by punishment, but by persuasion, by showing a different way of life. Baseball was part of that soft power, a cultural ambassador wrapped in leather gloves and wooden bats. By the late 1940s, some of those very POWs who had played baseball behind barbed wire were now introducing it to their children back in Germany. They might not have built major leagues or packed stadiums, but they carried a story that said, "We saw the enemy, and he was human." And perhaps that is why this chapter of history feels so remarkable. Amid one of the darkest conflicts the world has ever known, in a time when cruelty seemed boundless, there existed a pocket of humanity where laughter echoed across ball fields, where prisoners cheered for home runs instead of plotting escape, where the sound of a bat meeting a ball could, if only for a moment, silence the echoes of war. The German POWs could not believe it at first. Watching baseball in America's prison camps seemed like an impossible dream. Yet it was real. And long after the fences came down and the camps disappeared, the game, and the lesson it carried, remained. Because in the end, baseball was never just about innings or scoreboards. It was about something far more enduring. The reminder that even in war, even in captivity, humanity can still find a way to shine.